You may go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Gail Fatisi, the 2020 president of HJR. I want to welcome everyone who is joining us this morning for another free program from HJR. I am very excited about the two speakers that we have this morning. We have two exceptional speakers on our program, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker and give him the time instead of taking any more of your time myself. Our first speaker is Dr. Lawrence Yun. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with his name, if not having seen or heard him speak before. He is the Chief Economist and Senior Vice President of Research for the National Association of Realtors. He oversees and is responsible for a wide range of research activity for the association, including NAR's existing home sales statistics, affordability index, and home buyers and sellers profile report. Dr. Yun creates NAR's forecasts and participates in many economic forecasting panels. So that's where you probably have seen or heard him before. He also participates in the Industrial Economist Discussion Group at the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard. He appears regularly on financial news outlets, a frequent speaker at real estate conferences throughout the US, and has testified before Congress. Dr. Yun received his undergraduate degree from Purdue University and earned his PhD from the University of Maryland at College Park. We are very, very happy to have him with us this morning. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Yun.
Thank you, President Gale, for inviting me. And certainly as the president, you have been involved in the NAR functions, governing activity, and for during these difficult times, things like paycheck protection, loans availability for brokerages, along with the fact that unemployment insurance for the very first time ever eligible for independent contractors. So thank you for your efforts, President Gale. And also Richard Heggery in connecting it so that I can be here. Let me try to put my PowerPoint up in the screen because as an economist, we speak much better with PowerPoint than just talking. So let me try to do that here. All right, and then we'll put it in the screen mode. There we go. All right, so as we know, during the government-imposed economic lockdown, we simply cannot get out of home and do the normal economic activity. Therefore, it is no surprise that in the first quarter of this year, in fact, January and February, it was doing fine, but it was the March when we had that lockdown period. So in the first quarter, economy shrank by 5%. GDP, which is a measurement of total economic activity. And it was driven down due to the fact that consumers and business contracted spending, 7%, 8% down, respectively. But look at the next line, residential investment. It was up 18% even as the economy were going down. So what is residential investment? Things like spending related to home building activity, home sales, remodeling spending. So this just shows how strong the housing market had been before the pandemic. The next line, personal income in April, which is not first quarter, just beginning of the second quarter, most recently available data. To the surprise of many, personal income in total in America actually grew during this pandemic period. And you say, how is it possible? Because entrepreneurial income has fallen, the people's wage payment has fallen. So how is personal income actually grew? And it grew because of the massive government stimulus into the economy. So quite a sizable stimulus into it. And people did not spend this money that they have. And therefore, overall savings rate grew by 33%, or savings rate was at 33%, compared to just 8% 1 year ago, which means that as the economy steadily reopens, I know the New York City metro area, the focus point, the most impacted related to the virus, the shutdown, I think is just beginning to reopen now at the later stage compared to other places across the country. but there is a sizable savings that could go into the economy as the economy steadily reopens. So keep that in mind. And the most recent job numbers, or I should say the April, which was the most impacted, over 20 million job losses in the country, principally in the leisure and hospitality. So the hotel being shut down, airline, cruise ship, Disney World shut down, so large job cuts. But some job cuts were actually just temporary. Second line, for example, there were many nurses and doctors who became unemployed during the pandemic. I know we saw many images across the New York hospitals of the coronavirus and all. So how is it possible that nurses get laid off during this time period? And it is due to the fact that any non-coronavirus related work, say hip surgery, knee replacement, those were on hold, and they said any people specializing in those areas, job cuts occurred, including many dental offices had to shut down. But now as the economy is reopening, all the nurses are back to work, dental offices are back up to normal. Some of the retail trade is not, but slowly I think we will regain some of the losses that we encountered. This is the job market for the US, and as you can see that it's been quite a long job growth of over 10 years from the low point when we had a foreclosure crisis mess. But we were resilient, came out of it, and steady job growth. But look at the last line, suddenly in a single month, all the jobs that we gained in the 10 years were lost. But the May data shows slight recovery, and let's see how the job market plays out as the economy steadily reopens. This is the job in the Putnam-Rockland County region. So it shows these fairly steady employment, modest growth, and then in a single month, a plunge that you see that occurring. And also the Dutchess, Putnam counties, also very similar situation. Overall lower level of employment because it covers smaller population size, but in a single month, you see the damage that occurred. And when I look at the people who are filing for unemployment checks in the New York State, this is what it looks like. So before the lockdown, so mid-March, before the lockdown, there were only a handful, about 10,000 people filing for unemployment insurance for the very first time. So that was the usual dynamics of the economy. Then a sudden surge. So only comforting news in this chart is that number of people who are getting laid off and filing for unemployment insurance for the very first time, at least the peak has already occurred and declining. You can almost view this like the coronavirus. How many new cases? So if the line is flattening, at least we're at least containing it. It does not mean the situation is over. It just means that we have flattened the curve on number of people filing for unemployment insurance. And hence the total cases, total number of people receiving unemployment insurance has been steadily rising. This would be just addition of all those new cases minus some of the people who are finding jobs. And some encouragement. Most recent week, the number of cases is actually a little lower, which means that even though some people are getting laid off, there are job creation, say at FedEx, Amazon, warehousing. So total number of job creation is occurring. Dental office, I believe, are open in New York State. So people are beginning to visit, employment back up. So the worst case for employment situation may be over. Again, NAR advocated hard to assure that independent contractors tap into the unemployment insurance because realtors were hardworking and it was not their fault as to why the economy shut down. Home sales were interrupted during this process. So please tap into this emergency pandemic unemployment insurance during this disruption because it was not the fault of the realtors where your business activity suddenly went away. So we know that economy will return for the better later in the year, but in the meantime, please tap into the financial resources that is available. Now, this chart shows the overall unemployment check. In fact, let me actually turn towards the state of Texas, and then I will contrast with New York State. If you look at state of Texas, you see $165. What does that mean? It means that a typical person who lost a job in Texas their unemployment check today is actually $165 higher than the wages they were earning because of the enhanced unemployment insurance program. In the state of New York, you see $98 in parentheses, which means that person who lost a job, their unemployment insurance is not fully replacing those lost income on average. They're short by $100 per week. So there is a replacement of income, but not the total amount in the state of New York case. But massive disruption to all businesses. Please tap into the resources. The federal government has done many things trying to assure that during this temporary disruption, the economy at least will hold on for a while and then see a recovery. And hence the Federal Reserve has gone all in with something called quantitative easing. What does that mean? That means a lowest interest rate policy possible. So the overall impact is the following. The blue line is the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. It hit an all-time low of 3.2%. And the orange line is 10-year treasury yield. And if you look at the two graphs, both move very synchronized pattern. But if you look at the last data point, 10-year treasury is under 1%, which means that mortgage rate may be possible to go under 3%. So that is possibility, even though it's not a guarantee. So keep that in mind that there is a little larger gap between 30-year fixed rate mortgage and 10-year treasury. But the jumbo mortgages are not working because mortgages cannot be purchased by Fannie and Freddie. And in the current uncertainty, the Wall Street has pretty much said jumbo mortgages, if we cannot sell it to Fannie and Freddie, we're not gonna buy it. So therefore, anyone who's trying to obtain jumbo mortgages is much difficult now than before. The inventory situation, I've been hearing this from across the country, as well as in the Hudson Valley Gateway region, that last year you had inventory shortage, especially on the mid-price and below. On the upper end luxury market, there was plentiful inventory, so some price reduction was required on the expensive homes. Now, part of that was like property taxes. One could not fully deduct that anymore, and hence it became burdensome to own those expensive homes. But for the mid-price and below, very low inventory in relation to the buyers. So what happened during the pandemic? We went to even lower inventory, even greater housing shortage. So a very significant housing shortage during the pandemic, which is the reason why you are seeing in your region, generally median price this year being higher than last year. Many consumers are completely baffled by this. They're saying high unemployment rate, we are in a pandemic, but home prices are higher compared to 1 year ago. Well, the reasoning is just simple supply and demand. We don't have enough supply. So hopefully with reopening in the economy, you are able to get those listings, put the listings on the market, because we need more listing to come into the market. Significant housing shortage. Different story on the upper end. Upper end, you may have to reduce prices, but mid-price and below, significant shortage of inventory. The first evidence of the, the pandemic crisis is the signing of the contract. So the signing of the contract were actually higher by roughly 5% before the pandemic compared to the 1 year before. Just 1 second, please. So the pending contract was running well before the pandemic. And the first evidence is the month of March, so significantly lower than April, even lower. But with the economy steadily reopening in May in most states, we are seeing pending contracts beginning to rise. New York City area is late in the opening of the economy, so you may see more delayed recovery in pending contracts in the Hudson Gateway region. But the rest of the country, they are seeing much better condition in May versus 1 year compared to March and April. And I think it will steadily get better in the later months. And also the very early phase of home buying process, as realtors, you always tell your clients, get that mortgage approval. So mortgage application to buy a home was running above 1 year ago before the pandemic, then it was 35% below 1 year ago during early April. But now in recent weeks, it is actually above 1 year ago, meaning that buyers are coming back. People talk about, is it going to be a V-shaped recovery, U-shaped recovery, L-shaped recovery? Well, look at the graph. This is a V-shaped recovery, at least in the housing sector. So the other segment of the economy may take longer to recover, but home buying interest, quite a fast recovery in terms of people filing for mortgage applications. This does not mean mortgage approval. This means interest in buying a home. Interest in buying a home has clearly returned very solidly. The housing shortage will not go away anytime soon because, again, last year you had inventory shortage and the builders finally decide to produce little above historical average. Orange line is the historical average. And we have had a multiple years of underproduction. But during the pandemics, home building activity shut down also. And therefore, housing shortage will be with us for remainder of this year and next year, even as many consumers are facing record low mortgage rates. So don't be surprised. If you have those starter homes, you listed, you get multiple offers. Multiple offers has become very common on low price homes across the country because of inventory shortage. Now, the overall income, even during the pandemic, is a little higher, again, surprisingly so, because of the massive stimulus. Small business administration loans, those are loans in name, but it can turn into grants, meaning that you don't have to repay if you meet certain criteria, and unemployment insurance. So how is the government financing this massive government stimulus? Well, they're running up a huge budget deficit. And who is buying US debt? Is it the Chinese government? Is it the New York State Teachers of Retirement Fund? Who is buying the debt? And currently it is the Federal Reserve. Where is the Federal Reserve or Jay Powell getting the money, chairman of the Federal Reserve? They are printing money. They're printing the money to buy US government debt. So in essence, you can say all this unemployment check that is coming to the communities is printed check money. So if it's printed money, what does it mean for the future? Well, I can say that when you print money, economic textbook will say higher inflation. Inflation is a monetary phenomenon. You print money, we have inflation. But fortunately, America do not have to experience inflation because people trust the US dollar. Consider $20 bill. Take that $20 bill to Mexico, Vietnam, or even Italy and say, I want a haircut. And people will give you a haircut for that $20. If you use any other currency, there was no, I'm not going to do your haircut for that currency, but for the US dollar, they will. So even the printing of the money will not cause inflation in the US, at least this year, next year, or even for the next 2 or 3 years. But with so much printing of the money, and we have to do more printing of the money next year, inflation may begin to pop out 5, 6, 7 years from now. People in the 1970s experienced high inflation, prices of everything rose. But one thing that will not rise, even if America is hit with inflation, say 5 or 6 years from now, is people who locked in those low mortgage rates. Your monthly mortgage payment will remain fixed even as prices of everything else is rising. Something to relay to your client, given so much printing of the money, lock in those rates and lock in your mortgage payment for all the future years because it may be one of the rare golden opportunities to buy home. So home prices will be rising, but not mortgage payments. So again, very good opportunity for people who are able to buy a home in the current environment. So quickly, for the outlook is that last 2 years, the numbers were quite respectable. And I think the Hudson Gateway region also saw very similar stable home sales condition, even though home prices were rising. The first quarter was doing well, but the second quarter is where we will feel the hit, maybe down 30% across the country. New York City area, maybe more so in terms of lower transactions because of the greater incidence of the coronavirus and longer lockdown. Then later part of the year, it will be less severe negative. Then as we go into 2021, the very last column, everything lights up positively. Economy grows, job creation, net job creation, or home prices rising, and home sales just going up much stronger, essentially replacing any lost home sales occurred in 2020. Final comment is that even if the vaccine is discovered, I think there is a fundamental change. We are doing this Zoom presentation. I have had multiple office meetings using Zoom technology. So people are saying that maybe remote work is possible for many workers. Maybe rather than come to office 5 days a week, you can come to office only 2 days a week, which means that people do not have to live in Manhattan. Maybe they say, well, why don't I have a home out in Westchester County or even further out, knowing I don't have to commute every single day. And if that's the case, and also people are more reliant on work at home, maybe they need a larger size home, dedicated office space. So I think you are in a very good position where some of the people who have been living in Manhattan may decide to move further out. So I think you could pick up some activity, additional demand that is lifted from it. So best to you. My forecast will never be perfect, but based on what I'm seeing essentially a V-shaped recovery in home sales, while the prices continue to be elevated compared to 1 year before. So with that, thank you for listening, and I will now turn it back to President Gale.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yoon. We really appreciate it. Do you have time for a couple of questions if there are any, or should we move forward?
I know
your time is limited.
I can take a couple of questions.
Okay. Gary, can we just see if there are any questions in the chat?
Certainly. So, Dr. Yoon, are your projections the same regardless of the results of the election?
So the election situation, the country is so divided. And my prediction on the election is that it's going to be a blowout. I'm not sure which way, but hopefully it's a blowout so that there is a more clear mandate on the direction of the country. But what we generally see on presidential election is that Washington, D.C. region housing market is impacted during the election, but most other parts of the country, what happens is that it's really a pocketbook issue. If the mortgage rates are low, they fear they have a secure job, they want to take advantage of the conditions. Only the very upper end market, there is some hesitancy. They don't know what the tax policy may change. So very upper end, there is some hesitancy. But for the middle class, there is a pocketbook issue, and mortgage rates should remain low for the remainder of the year.
Okay. That is all I have in questions in the chat box or in Q&A. Richard, any questions?
Yes, Dr. Yoon, just a quick question in terms of urban areas, cities like New York, like San Francisco, like New Orleans, who rely on a lot of tourism, especially with New York, where we have a lot of European and worldwide tourism. Do you think it's going to potentially be a little bit rockier road to recovery? And also in terms of the commercial real estate market, given the restrictions that may exist for a little bit longer, do you think that commercial may take a little bit deeper hit?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Commercial real estate is going to be very difficult. So the industrial warehouse prices are still rising, shortage of inventory, but retail sector, vacant leasing, the hotel industry. So commercial property prices have risen even faster than residential before the pandemic. Now, I think the commercial prices, say you have a diversified commercial real estate portfolio, commercial real estate prices, I think, are going to fall about 10% over the next 1 or 2 years. So because of the rising vacancy, office demand will be very weak, even as we come out of the pandemic. But New York City, I always say, Washington, I'm here in Washington, or the suburb of Washington. Washington is the US capital, but New York is the global capital of everything. So given that status, it will come back, but I think in a different way. I think everyone will still want to see the Broadway plays. They want to experience the New York City, walking through Manhattan, great experience. So I think that will always be present. But the Dr. Fauci was mentioning that he believed that vaccine will be discovered by the year end. But I think some permanent changes on office demand and retail space, I think it's going to take a little longer to recover and certainly air travel, there's a lot of caution there.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for listening, but I have to now leave, but thank you so much for inviting.
Dr. Yoon, we really appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're very appreciative. That was great information. I got a lot out of that. I hope all of you did. Now we're going to take a little bit local. Joe Rand has been a great friend of mine and a great friend of the association's for many, many years. He is a true number cruncher. I'm going to briefly read his bio. Joe is the Chief Creative Officer of Better Homes and Gardens Rand Realty, one of the largest real estate companies in the New York tri-state region with almost 30 offices and 1,200 agents, closing more than 6,000 transactions worth over $2.5 billion in sales volume in 2018. He manages the company's career development and education programs, principally based on his concept of client-oriented real estate, or CORE, which is designed to raise the level of client service provided by the real estate industry. He is the author of Disruptors, Discounters, and Doubters, about how the industry can overcome the challenges posed by disruption by raising the bar on client experiences. Actually, Joe, over the last 6 months, you may want to do a new edition of that book that I've read. It's a great book, as well as How to Be a Great Real Estate Agent, about how agents can build their businesses by becoming better at identifying and servicing their client needs. He's spoken at numerous industry conferences, including the Inman Connect, Realtor Triple Play, and Riz Media CEO Summit. In 2018, Joe was honored by Riz Media with one of the inaugural Industry Newsmaker Awards and recognized by Inman News as one of the top 100 real estate influencers. And in 2019, was recognized in the Real Estate Almanac from T360 Advisors in the Swanepoel Power 200 as one of the most powerful people in real estate. I actually asked Joe to come on because he shared with me a publication he had been working on for at least a month now that was comparing what we've gone through with the onslaught of the COVID-19 virus with other economic events or tragedies that have occurred in this area, including Superstorm Sandy, 9/11, the 2008 recession, and it was a very thoughtful piece. And I thought, Joe, that you all would benefit from hearing Joe's take on how those different scenarios compare. So Joe, without further ado, I'm passing it off to you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Gail. Thank you, everybody from the association. It's really an honor to speak here at my home association. I've done this talk at a couple of different places in Austin, Texas, and I'll be doing it up. I'll be zooming up to New Hampshire in a couple of days. But it's always really a pleasure to speak close to home to people I know and people I work with. And yeah, the basic thing I wanted to talk about, I've been doing data analysis for my company for almost 20 years. I've been with the company since 2001, starting in like 03 or so. I started writing the quarterly market report that we put out where we crunch all the numbers of the areas that we service. And I usually do it on a quarterly basis, but because of the pandemic, I've been doing it really almost every 2 weeks and issuing a report every month because I thought it was really important for us to really keep our pulse on what was happening. And I'll tell you, I really went into this at the end of March when the essential services order came down. I really thought that we were going to look at a very difficult situation because I took that literally, that agents weren't going to be able to show houses and government offices were going to be closed and title companies were going to be closed. And I didn't see how we were going to close things. I didn't see how we were going to open things. I didn't see who was going to go and put their property on the market as a listing, when they're living in it under a certain amount of a quarantine. And I will tell you, like a lot of other people, I have been enormously inspired and impressed by the work that the members of the association have done. My agents, but agents at other companies, the creativity they have brought. I've been impressed by the creativity and the flexibility of the title companies who have managed to close deals with certain conditions that they never had to put on before, that everybody's pulled together to keep the market alive in a way that I really thought we were going to take a much bigger hit than we did. And I just want to show you some numbers of where we stand right now before I get into talking about how the market, why I think it's going to be resilient over the next 6 months based on what's happening with the pandemic. So here are home sales compared to 2019 in Hudson Gateway. The top line is the regional number. And then each individual market, although I combined the condo co-op markets with single families outside of Westchester because the condo markets are relatively small. You can see April sales and May sales. And this is all the comparison to 2019. So you can see regionally, April, we were down 27%, May down 25%. Now, of course, you all know when I explain this to consumers, I have to explain to them that the closings in April and May are largely a reflection of activity in January, February, March because of the pipeline. So the fact that we were down only 27% in April, 25% in May is to some extent the fact that we came in with a very big, the market was very robust in the first quarter. First quarter was up, sales up, prices, even with the last half of March falling off significantly when the pandemic started. But so this number's pretty good because the closings are how we get paid. So we're down a quarter or so from last year over the course of 2 months, but not dramatically, not off the shelf, not out of business. Here's new contracts, which is a little bit worse because we don't have the big pipeline. The new contracts depend on us putting deals together within the context of the pandemic, down 53% in April and then getting better in May. And I thought it would be the other way because I thought a lot of the April contracts would be handshakes that happened in March and deals that didn't just, they just didn't quite get finished until April. So they weren't as affected by the pandemic. But in fact, I think what happened was we all adjusted to the realities of the pandemic. The consumer adjusted and our contracts actually got a little closer to last year's numbers compared to April. May got a little bit better. Here's where I think we had a real change was in listings. In April, listings fell off a cliff. Who was listing their home in April? It was a very difficult time. Things eased up a lot in May. You can see April listings regionally down 73%, May down only 40% compared to last year. I think you're in the field, you realize how tight inventory is. You've seen the buyer demand hasn't gone anywhere, which has had the effect of driving prices up. Prices are significantly up in April and May compared to last year. That is partly a result of the reflection of the tight inventory and still high levels of demand because of like Dr. Yoon said, interest rates, but also just, even with the people losing jobs, even with the shock to the stock market, buyer demand went nowhere. And in fact, we had an influx of demand that we'll talk about in a little bit and that Dr. Yoon alluded to with people coming out of New York City. So at the tight, we've had prices go up. Also, I think prices are up a little artificially because the kind of people who can close in this market might have a little bit more means than people who are going to wait to close until things even up. So, but some of it's real. Some of that average sales price increase is real. And here's where we stand in Westchester and Hudson Valley over the course of the year to date. So this includes a really robust first quarter and then obviously April and May being a little more difficult. And in terms of closings, we're down 11% from last year, which is significant. You're down 11%, that's a hit to the pocketbook, but it's moderated a little bit because the average sales price is up. So the volume is going to be a little bit better than 11%, but also considering what we've gone through and what could have happened, I think this is a rather extraordinary result that it shows even within the context of the first phase of the pandemic, how resilient agents were, how resilient the market was. And that brings us to what I want to talk about now, which is what's next? What are we going to see in this market for the rest of the year? What will happen now that we're kind of bridging? So I think of it as the end of the beginning. We're at the end of the beginning of the pandemic. We're now starting the beginning of the middle. The middle is going to be this period where we're all wearing masks and we can't eat inside in restaurants and we can't have large functions. And that will go on probably until there's a vaccine or some sort of really ameliorative treatment for the COVID-19, at which point we'll go into the end, the beginning, middle, end. We're right now at the beginning of the middle. When we get the vaccine, we'll be at the beginning of the end, and that's when things will start getting back to whatever the next normal will be. But what's next in this market given these circumstances? And to analyze this, as Richard said, what I did was, I said, well, how has the market rebounded after other kinds of shock to the system? And the real model for me was 9/11, because I remember hearing the same things in 2001 that we're hearing now. No one's going to want to live in Manhattan. It's got a target on its back. It's a target for terrorist activity. Now, I lived in Manhattan during 9/11. I'm sure Richard did as well. It was, one of the most traumatic experiences of my life, one of the most traumatic experiences that all of us ever, if you lived through it, that you went through. And so I don't mean to, when I'm doing this analysis, I don't mean to minimize the human cost of all of these things. I'm looking at it purely from an analytical perspective of how it affects the market. But I remember people saying the same thing as they're saying now: everyone's going to leave the city, and it's going to devastate the housing market. And in fact, 9/11 passed and had very little impact on the housing market, as we'll see in a minute. But then I went to say, let me look and see what else. We've had other shocks to the system, to the housing market. How is the housing market rebounded after those shocks? So let's look at them. I did 3 case studies of our New York area: the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the financial crisis of 08, 09, and then the Superstorm Sandy in 2012. And I'll go over each of them. I'll cover them briefly because I want to get it to the conclusions. And the report is out. You can get the report. If you're friends with me on Facebook, I'll post it again today. You can find it. It's about 20 pages, and it goes into more depth, gives you all the grounding of how we came up with this conclusion. But if you remember 9/11, what were some of the things that we looked at in terms of how it could impact the market? The first was, what kind of operational disruption was there? Because right now in the pandemic, we're dealing with significant and severe operational disruption. We've got government offices closed down. We've got municipal offices closed down. You can't get municipal reports. We've had real estate offices shut down, real estate agents put where they can't do showings. So operational disruption, very big. How does that compare to the operational disruption of 9/11? 9/11, I mean, it was extreme, but it was short term. I mean, they shut down travel. You couldn't leave Manhattan for a few days. They shut down government operations. But if you can remember, if you went through this, within a couple of days, there was this mantra: don't let the terrorists win. And we were all trying to get back to normal. I was teaching at Fordham Law at the time. 9/11 was a Tuesday. I had classes on Thursday. I taught a class Thursday morning. I can remember walking in, everybody's crying. We couldn't do our normal routine. But we have to get back to work. That was the idea. So the operational disruption was short term. Here's what we really found when we did this analysis to be determinative of how the market rebounded. And that was, what was the condition of the economy and what was the condition of the housing market prior to the crisis. If the housing market was strong, if it was in good shape, it tended to shrug off the crisis, the effects of the crisis, the impact of the crisis. If the economy or the housing market was weak, what tended to happen was the crisis kind of, struck at that weakness and exploded it. So with regard to the economy, 9/11, the economy was not in great shape in 2001. We'd had an election. The year before was the the first dot-com bust. By 2001, Dow and the GDP were stable, but there was definitely a feeling that a recession was coming, which is why, if you remember, George Bush was elected with the promise of tax cuts to stimulate the economy and things like that. And in fact, the impact of 9/11 on the economy, either the impact of 9/11 or 9/11 coincided with, can't say it's causal, it might be just simply corollary, that GDP fell from 4.1 to 1.0. Unemployment climbed up to almost 6%. GDP, Dow fell 25%. It fell immediately very badly, and then over 25% over the 2 years. So the impact on the economy, on a weakened economy, was substantial. Impact on the housing market, negligible, minimal. The housing market shrugged it off. The housing market in 2001 was at the beginning of a massive seller market cycle that had started in the late 90s, and we know would continue to to the late, should have continued to like 2005, 06, but it went all the way to 08. And so what was the impact on the housing market? Almost nothing. Closings slowed in the fourth quarter. They were down probably because of the operational disruption and people thrown off their game, but they were back up in the first quarter. They recovered in the first quarter, and then they were up. And you can see this sort of in this graph. Here's the New York metro area. This is not just us. This is the existing homes report that Dr. Yoon puts out every month. This is the New York metro area, which includes not just Westchester, not just the Hudson Gateway area, but the entire area, including Manhattan. And you can see the terrorist attacks came in the third quarter of 2001, and that the blue line is sales, and you can see sales dipped a bit afterwards. Then they came up in the first quarter. Then they kind of bounced around, but they generally increased. But you can see what happened with prices. Prices just kept on going all the way through really through the end of 2005, and prices continued to go up, as we know, to 2008 when this happened. Oh, I was going to be so, when this happened, the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. I lived through 9/11, living in Manhattan. I lived through the financial crisis as a real estate broker. If you were in business in 2008, 2009, give yourselves a round of applause that you made it through that period, because that was a scary period of time. There was a time at the end of 2008, early 2009, when I thought, is anybody going to buy a house this quarter? Why in the world would anybody buy a house this quarter? The economy was in turmoil. The housing market was in turmoil. We were losing hundreds of thousands of jobs every month. And housing prices were going down 5-10% every quarter. They went down about 30% over the course of like 18 months, something like that. About 20% over 18 months. So let's look at the financial crisis. We know what started it. We think of it, people call it a housing bubble. In my mind, it was a credit bubble, because what really happened, let me look at the graph here. So this is, again, the metro area, single family homes, sales and median prices, 2005, 2014. If you look at that blue line, the blue line, sales really topped out in 2005. The market goes in like 9-year cycles. The seller market should last between 8 and 9 years. And then there's 8 or 9 years of happiness, 8 or 9 years of woe. That's kind of the way the housing market has worked over the last 40 years in our area, and really mostly nationally. And really the seller's market in that period had kind of started by like 96, 97. And it probably should have run out by 05, which is when sales started to tail off. And you can see sales really tailed off for a year or two, but it took a couple of years for prices to catch up. I can remember reading market reports in 06 and 07 saying, demand is down, sales are down, but prices keep going up. Why? Because sellers have not gotten the message yet. They're still demanding a premium from what their neighbors sold last year. But buyers are like, I'm not so sure. That's why there's fewer sales. But the sales that are happening, the sellers are winning that battle, that negotiating battle with buyers. So prices keep going up, but there's fewer sales because not as many buyers are willing to bite. And then at some point, it all comes crashing down. At some point, what really happened was this whole period between 05 and 08 was this artificial extension of housing demand from the expansion of subprime mortgages. And when that came out, housing market just fell off a cliff. Lehman Brothers fell, Bear Stearns fell. We'll talk about the home buyer tax credit in a little bit, but you can see what it looked like at that time and what we all went through. So what happened in the financial crisis? Operational disruption, none. No business. I mean, businesses went out of business, banks went out of business, but government offices didn't shut down or anything like that. There was no infrastructure damage. But really the key point was that pre-crisis, both the economy and the housing market, interlinked at that point, were poised for a problem. We're poised for a come down, a correction. And in fact, the financial crisis is unique. And I've looked at lots of different case studies now. The financial crisis is unique in the way that it was intrinsically tied to housing. The over-leveraged asset that brought the economy down was housing. So housing, obviously took a hit when the economy took a hit. They were intertwined at that point, and you can see how bad things got. The financial crisis is the one crisis I've looked at in the 3 that we looked at for this report, but I also have done a report nationally where I looked at 7 case studies, including Camp Fire in Northern California. I looked at the floods in Houston. I looked at Katrina in New Orleans. I looked at Andrew in Miami, in addition to the ones we're talking about. And in none of them did I find any real impact of the crisis on the housing market, except for the financial crisis. And the financial crisis wasn't a natural disaster, but it was an economic catastrophe that was inextricably tied to housing, unlike the pandemic, which is not inextricably tied to housing. The pandemic has nothing to do with housing. Neither did the campfires, neither did the floods. And so that's why I think the financial crisis is a little bit of its own thing and really can't be used as a model for what we can expect from the pandemic. All right, and then finally, Superstorm Sandy, which can be a stand-in for all the other natural disasters I looked at, almost none of which had any impact on the local economy and any impact on the housing market. And if you were here in 2012, October 2012, for Sandy, I was right down, I had a different home at the time. I was living on the water in Nyack, and I watched that. I stupidly stayed in my apartment on right on the waterfront, and I watched the boats float by that had gotten unmoored. And the next, I had to leave my apartment because I didn't have electricity. We didn't have electricity for a week. You couldn't get ice. When the ice showed up in the supermarket, everybody rushed to get ice because we're all going crazy. I can remember trying to figure out how I'm going to sell houses when the houses are all damaged, when I can't communicate because there's no phones. I can't communicate because the offices are closed. There's no electricity. But the fact is, no impact. No impact. Look at New York Metro. New York Metro after Superstorm Sandy. No impact on prices. They started to recover after 9/11, after the financial crisis, and they continue to recover. They didn't take no blips. Same thing with sales. Not a blip, not a change. And Sandy had no impact on the housing market. As big as a shock as it was to the system, it had no impact. I even looked at, because I say, well, you know what, maybe New York Metro is too big a market, and Sandy would have much more of an impact on like a waterfront market. So I looked at Monmouth County down in Jersey, which encompasses a lot of the Jersey Shore properties. Monmouth County, all that happened was that prices spiked because of a lack of inventory after the hurricane, but nothing else. I mean, no long-term impact on the market at all. Which brings us to the pandemic. What characterizes the pandemic? The operational disruption is much more significant than anything we saw after 9/11, after a financial crisis, after any of the natural disasters. We're talking about an operational disruption that for 2.5 months has shut us down, and for the next few months is going to really hold us back. And it's an operational disruption to the entire economy, not just the housing economy. So it's a much more severe thing. So that's significant. That makes it different from the others. So there's a point you should make a distinction there. But here's the other important point. Both the housing market and the economy pre-crisis were in very good condition. The economy was strong, the housing market was strong, and in these types of external shocks to the housing market, the housing market has tended to shrug them off. The only one that didn't shrug off was the financial crisis, which was not really an external shock because the economic shock came out of housing. You know, economy didn't bring the housing market down. The housing market brought the economy down. So the pandemic is unusual in the sense that the operational disruption is going to be more severe. But at the same time, what the good news is that we came into it with a very strong economy and a very strong housing market. Now you can see short term what's been happening. I think Dr. Unum alluded to this. This is the existing homes report from NAR, and you can see the prices haven't been affected. That's the orange line, but sales obviously fell dramatically in April. But here's the thing. Based on what we just said, here are the reasons to be optimistic going forward about where we think the housing market will go for the rest of the year. Number one, the market disruptions are temporary. Even though the disruptions are going to have been extensive for 2.5 months, and even though they will continue to impair us and the general economy, there is an end date. Like, we didn't have any infrastructure damage. We didn't lose anything. We're just simply being restricted in some ways from freely operating. But those restrictions will end eventually. And from what we've seen, the operational disruption does not eliminate buyer demand. It just delays it or holds it back, but it doesn't go anywhere. Yes, we've had some buyer demand that we might have lost based on people losing their jobs, people losing money in the stock market. That's nibbling around the edges. But the fundamental driver of buyer demand, rates, and then economic situation, and then prices, those are all, are in fairly good shape. And yes, we've lost a lot of jobs, but you saw Dr. Ewan's presentation where the jobs were generally in areas that are not necessarily corresponding to the kinds of people that buy homes in Westchester and the Hudson Valley. You know, the human cost of the loss of jobs is incalculable. It's awful what people are going through. My heart goes out to them. We have to have empathy for everybody. But if we just dispassionately look at its impact on the housing market, the fact that the losses in jobs have been in hospitality, they've been in restaurants, they've been in areas like that, which are not necessarily people that are buying homes in our area. You know, the white collar jobs that fuel the Westchester market, those people have been working from home for 3 months. They didn't lose their jobs. And maybe they were furloughed. Maybe they've been put on, they've had their pay reduced, but they haven't lost their jobs. So the market disruptions, I think, are temporary. Just to give you an example, as an analogy, let's look at airlines after 9/11. Airlines, the 9/11 was devastating to the airlines, right? I mean, awful. Who wanted to fly after that? And 9/11 changed the way we fly. It didn't just drive demand down for flying in the short term, but it made flying harder. It made you had to jump through more hoops. You had to go through, in other words, the same way that real estate, it got really hard immediately was we couldn't show houses. And then over time, it's going to be harder because there's going to be restrictions on us that we didn't have before. So, but look at the operational disruption. Within a year after the immediate short-term impact on housing stopped, on passengers stopped, they'd gotten back to 60 million passengers by month. So they were down about 10% by a year later in passenger airlines. And then it bounced around. That was probably what you're seeing in that latter half of the graph where it's a lot of up and down. That's probably a lot of economic stuff, not necessary. Remember, the economy went really south after 9/11, more so than people being afraid to fly. But it did take them 3 years. It took them until July 2004 for passengers to eclipse the all-time high that they had in August. But except for that big drop right after 9/11, look at the graph. If that drop in September and October of 2001, if those aren't there, the graph just kind of bounces around a lot, right? It just kind of bounces. It doesn't there's no long-term depression of airlines. And that's why I say the disruptions are meaningful, but they're temporary. And the same way that the airlines bounce back after 9/11, I think that whatever disruptions we're going through will not hold back the housing market in the long term. Number two, like I've said, the housing market has been resilient to external shocks like natural disasters or the pandemic. I looked at all these crisis events that you're seeing on the screen for a follow-up report that I did for the national audience. And you can see the housing market in almost all these cases was in good shape pre-crisis, and the impact on the housing market was negligible. The only exception, the financial crisis, which we've talked about. And there's also an exception in Katrina because the housing market recovered in 2005, 2006 a little bit, and then it fell off. But that was to some extent, I think, the national, that was the national market falling off more than it was caused by Katrina. I think there's a correlation there more than a causation. I don't think it helped, but I think it was, in the short term, Katrina actually drove sales and prices because of the reduction of inventory, as sad as that sounds. But the basic idea is that the housing market has been resilient to external shocks. I don't count financial crisis in there because the financial crisis was an internal shock, not an external shock. Number three, the economy was strong when the pandemic hit. The economy was in good shape. Dr. Yoon went over a lot of the economic indicators, but the basic idea is that the pandemic unemployment was kept going down. He looked at it by employed people. This is the unemployment rate. You can see the unemployment rate was just trending down from 2017. It had been trending down from 2009, 2010. And then you had this spike up in, and then it came down a little bit in the May numbers. The economy was in good shape. And in the past, when the economy has been in good shape, it has tended to shrug off external shocks to the economy. Now, this might be different because it is a much more severe shock than we have with a hurricane or 9/11 or whatever else. But, there's reason to believe that at least we came in with a strong economy, not a weak economy. Number four, the housing market was in great shape. We've talked about that first quarter. In our market, first quarter was in fantastic shape. Look at the graph. This is historical going back to early 2002. You can see the financial crisis. You can see the bouncing around that we did. But you can see that in the first quarter, on a rolling year basis, both sales and prices were up. And they were up pretty significantly over the first quarter of last year. And that's even with the last 2 weeks kind of falling off. So the market was strong when this all happened. And from a long-term basis, what you're looking at here is Westchester and Bergen County. The average inflation-adjusted average sales price going back to 1981. And what you see is you can see the inflation-adjusted average sales price going up during sellers markets and then coming down in both counties. And the fact that the reason I put both of them up there is that it's interesting that they both, even though they're separated by the Hudson River and some other territory, they're responding to national and regional trends in housing. And so they really behave very similarly. But the thing that's interesting to look at is, guys, we've had a good market. Sales have been up really since 2013, almost every year since 2013. We took a little bit of a hit in 18 because of the SALT cap. But we haven't had any increase in the inflation adjusted average sales price. Like, we still have a lot of meat on the bone on the seller's market. There still is a lot of room for growth of prices. That this is not necessarily true about California, where they've had, that graph would look very differently in California. But in New York, in our area, you know, prices have not gone up substantially since the bottom of the market. We're still like 03, 04 levels without considering inflation. You know, we're above 03. We're actually 03, 04 levels without considering inflation. You factor inflation, we're below 03 levels. You can see now, if you track this Westchester graph all the way down, we're really like an 01 level if you control for inflation. All right. So the market cycle, this pandemic is hitting at the perfect state of the market cycle, when the market cycle is in really good shape. All right. And the same thing is true of the United States. You can see the same sort of inflation adjusted pricing going forward. You have the three humps for the United States, and the most recent increase in pricing. We haven't seen it locally, but they've seen it in other markets. Also, Dr. Yoon alluded to this. He had a slide about this, that we might see some pent-up demand in the suburbs. This is an article from the Record, Times Herald Record in Orange County, about people moving from the city into the suburbs. We have all heard that anecdotally. We have all thought it makes sense. People leaving the city, moving out because it's easier to work from home than it used to be, and they're afraid of the density in Manhattan, so they want to get out, or they want to get out of Queens or wherever else. And I think there's some truth to it. I think we have to be a little careful about that we don't overreact to it, because you were hearing the same things after 9/11. People want to get out of the city, and we've all seen what happens in Manhattan real estate since 2001. So I think it's a little overblown, but there is some reality to it, and we've all experienced it. I think a lot of people who were on the fence about leaving Manhattan, this was the thing that pushed them over. I think also people are saying, well, the millennials don't want to live in Manhattan anymore. The millennials are all in their late 30s. It's not that they're millennials, it's that they're in their late 30s. People in their late 30s, they leave the city. That's what I did. That's what many of you did. If you lived in Manhattan, you eventually leave. Your kids, unless you want your kids to live in a closet, you got to leave Manhattan and move out to the suburbs. All right. So we might see some pent-up demand. I did look at this internally. I pulled data from Updater, a company called Updater that we do business with, that helps people in their moves when they do their change of address. And I had them pull change of address information for 2019 and up through May to tell me where buyers were doing, our buyers, this is just my company data, where our buyers were doing their change of address from. And you can see these are the registered moves. This isn't all the moves. These are just the moves that people used Updater. Not everybody uses Updater. And then the second column is the moves from New York City, and then the percentage from New York City. You can see in 2019, we had about 9.2% of the buyers did their change of address, who registered their change of address with Updater, did it. 9.2 did it. They were from New York City. 2020 so far, it's 10.8. April and May was 11.5. May, just May, 11.8. This includes renters, by the way. This includes renters. So 11.8 from 9.2, that's significant. That's a big increase. It's not 20%. It's not crazy up, but it's measurable. It's significant. So I think there will be some demand for our area, and that's good for our area. I'm not saying whether it's good or bad for Manhattan. And I know that now One Key MLS covers Manhattan, Richard, and covers Long Island and all these other places as well, as Richard has pursued his quest for world domination. But it may not be great for Manhattan real estate, but I think it's probably good for us in the suburbs. Number 6, I got to be quick now. Government assistance. Government assistance saved the housing market in 2009. Look at what the tax credit did. Everybody laughed at that homebuyer tax credit. Look, everything's falling. The tax credit starts, everything starts going back up. And then the tax credit ends, everything falls a little bit again, but it generally stabilizes. And I think that all those CARES Act programs have had their intended impact of stabilizing our economy, stabilizing employment, keeping people afloat until this pandemic eases. So I think I see a lot of comparisons between the homebuyer tax credit and although everybody hates the the acts in 2009, the TARP acts. Everybody gets mad about them. They helped stabilize the economy. They saved the economy. And I think the CARES acts are doing the same thing. And then finally, homes are more affordable now than they ever have been before. I'm going to show you graphs that are going to blow you away. Here's the thing about affordability. Affordability is not based on price. Affordability is based on payment. And payment is not just price, but it's price and rate. And if you're going to measure affordability over time, you have to figure out the price and the prevailing rate and factor in the effects of inflation. So what we did was we went through the Westchester, we have the numbers for Hudson Gateway, we have them for Westchester going back to 1981. We have the other markets going back to 2000 or so. We took the median, the average price of a home for sale that's sold in that market. We took the average interest rate for a 30-year fixed rate loan based on what Freddie Mac was telling us. So we calculated the monthly payment each year, and then we controlled for inflation. And here's what it looks like. The big blue line is Westchester. We have data going back Westchester back to 81. Data in orange going back to 93. Data in Rockland, Dutchess, Putnam going back to 01. What you see is that the monthly payment you have to make on your mortgage payment to buy a home in Westchester, look at the line it's touching. It's $3,000, a little over $3,000 in the first quarter of 2020. And that's lower than it's been any time since 1981. And I will tell you, I don't have the average price going back to the 70s, but I will guarantee you it's lower than it was any time in the 70s. And you can see the line is exactly the same for the other counties, which means that I feel safe to say I'd be willing to wager a lot of money that the monthly payment you have to make to buy a home in any of these counties basically goes back. It's lower than it's been in any of those counties since the 70s. And why is that? It's a function of rate. It's a function of that prices haven't really gone up in our market, but it's really true everywhere. Here is the United States. This is based on the EHR, the existing homes report, going back to 1968. That's why I feel pretty confident that we're lower than we were in the 70s, all right? Because nationally we are. Now, nationally, the number's higher than it's been since 2012. 2012 nationally was a good time to buy a home in terms of locking in monthly payment. But if you go out of the current recovery, right now, the monthly payment to buy a home in the United States is lower than any time going back to 1968 in real terms. And it's actually better if you look at it by regions, because the West is screwing everything up, because the West has had a big run in the last couple of years. But if you look at the Northeast, the green line, look at the green line. It's as low as it's been anytime since 1999, and I guarantee you it's as low as it's been anytime since the late 60s, early 70s. So the point is, homes are more affordable now, which makes them very buyable. Why? Because interest rates are where they are. This is an interest rate chart going back to 1968. You can see where interest rates are. The basic idea and the message we should be conveying is that it really is it's a great time to buy a home, lock in a rate like Dr. Yoon said, lock in that mortgage rate for less. That's just the monthly payment. Don't get me started on the taxes. Taxes are a different thing. Insurance is a different thing, but the monthly payment lower than it's been in a generation, maybe 2 generations. All right. So predictions. I think second quarter closings will be off by 25-30% overall, because we've already booked 2/3 of the quarter, and that's where we are. And I don't think that June is going to make up for any of that. I do think June opens will be close to 2019 levels. I think they're going to come back. We got most of a month left. I think there's going to be a ton of activity between now and the end of June. I think July opens are going to hit a record. I think July opens are going to be like when the first quarter of 2010, when the tax credit got everybody wanting to buy a home. I think the opens are going to be huge in July, which means I think August closings are going to hit a record. And I think third quarter, very close to last year. I think for the year, we'll be down 8 to 10% in the regional area that I've been covering. I think because we've booked a lot of the year. We were up in the first quarter, we'll be down in the second quarter. We'll be even in the third and fourth, but that second quarter will drive us down over the course of the year. This all assumes the economy doesn't go completely sideways in the next 6 months, but I think that's a fairly safe assumption. So I'm fairly bullish on where the market's going to be, because I've seen the resiliency of this market before. After 9/11, after Katrina, after the financial crisis, we have recovered, and I think we'll recover again. And a lot of that's due to the hard work of the people watching this and the people that are members of the Hudson Gateway. So I'll leave you with that. I don't know if we have time to take any questions or anything like that. I've gone over my time, so I apologize for that, but I hope you got something out of this.
Joe, that was tremendous. It's a lot of information. I'm glad you're making that available. I really agree with your optimism because it's so well founded on numbers. It's not a lot of speculation there. It's really a hard look and deep dive into the numbers. So I think your conclusions are pretty persuasive. I think I've had some concerns about the New York City market, if that's going to be an ultimate drag on the suburban market, but I remember the same thing that you remember. Lower Manhattan was going to be dead. Nobody would come back to Lower Manhattan. Well, now look at Lower Manhattan now. I mean, that built up in an incredible way. So I think that short term people tend to look at, the immediate numbers, the immediate panic, how are we ever going to get out of this? But they forget just how resilient we truly are as a region.
Yeah, the thing about these crises is that when you're in the middle of them, you can't see how they could possibly end well. Like I can remember after 9/11, the feeling we all had. I can remember after the hurricane, I'm like, oh, this is going to kill the housing market. Certainly was going to kill the housing market on the Jersey Shore, and it didn't impact the housing market on the Jersey Shore. The fact is, I just think that this market is very resilient. The overall trends of the market are very positive. And you're right, I'm not blowing smoke. I mean, I do these numbers for purposes of our own forecasting as a company of how we're going to invest our resources. And it's not to me about making people feel good or trying to inspire them. If you go read my market reports in 07 and 06, you won't see me saying it's a great time to buy. I was saying, why the hell are people buying? Sales are way down, demand is way down. How are prices continuing to go up? But the fact is we got to be real. You got to be real about this stuff.
So Gary, I think we have maybe one or two questions we can hit before we sign off.
Yes. Can you predict the residential market in New York City?
I don't have any deep insight into the residential market in New York City. There's a lot of smart people that look at that. I mean, I tend to think that they were already going through, if you look at the way I've analyzed this, the housing market in Manhattan came into this a little staggered. It was already hurting a little bit overbuilt, a little bit over leveraged, overvalued. So I think New York City and Manhattan might have a little bit of a price correction in front of them, which could impact us, like Richard said, in the sense that when prices in Manhattan go down, it makes people want to stay. I think the untold story of the last 10 years is that Westchester suffered significantly. And the reason we haven't seen average sales price gains in Westchester since 2012 is because Brooklyn happened. And Brooklyn sucked up a lot of those people who historically would have been moving to Westchester or Fairfield County or Bergen County, all of which had the same thing, which they haven't really seen an increase in the average sales price. I think because a lot of those people settled in Brooklyn. Now I think a lot of those people are going to be leaving Brooklyn because even that's gotten too pricey.
We've received many accolades. So thank you very much, Joe. And I'm all through with questions. So
I actually have just a quick question, Joe. It's now official that we are in a recession. How do you think that plays into consumer confidence, the mindset in terms of housing? Do you see any impact just by, hearing officially now that we are in this recession?
I mean, I think that all the things that we've talked about in terms of, this awful situation coming out of Minneapolis that's dominated the news in the last 2 weeks. I think all of the polarization of the reaction to the COVID-19 of like, oh, wearing a mask is now a political act, things like that. I think all of that stuff, including the consumer confidence that comes from officially we're in a recession because of the way the numbers play out, even though we knew we were going to be in a recession within a couple of weeks of this happening. I think all that goes into it, but the way I look at it is I tend to see these things in long-term seismic trends that tend to overcome these short-term disruptions. Like, the same way that's the reason I looked at all these natural disasters. Natural disasters are incredibly impactful to psyche. They're incredibly impactful to the damage to infrastructure, impactful to the local economy. And yet the housing market shrugs it off. If the housing market's strong, it goes right along. And that I think is because of, it's long-term currents of demographics and interest rates and overall economy and, people, one thing that always shocked me is I looked at how many sales we had in the first quarter of 2019 before the tax credit came into effect, and people were still buying homes. And I'm like, why are people still buying homes? And the fact is they just have to buy a home. They need a home. They had a kid, they need a home. They got transferred, they needed a home. people buy homes and sell homes because of reasons that defy explanation, easy explanation. And I think the same thing's true. Yeah, consumer confidence is going to be weak. I think we're going to have some issues, but I think overall, I think the market will shrug all that stuff off. And we're seeing that. I mean, listen, everybody on this call is seeing, they've got buyers calling them up out like crazy to go see houses before the houses were available to be shown. They couldn't even show them, and they were getting inquiries. I think that the demand is really there.
I do have one quick question. Did the pandemic bring the recession? Our economy was robust before that.
I think the economy was in good shape before that. I mean, they're looking now and they're saying that February and March might have been not as strong as we thought at the time. But I think that the economic condition was fine. I think the economy will. I mean, I'm not an economist. So we'll leave Dr. Yoon gave his opinions on that. I just generally feel that the housing market locally, which is what I really look at and what I like to think of myself as being expert in, I think the housing market will shrug a lot of this stuff off, unless the Dow goes to 15,000 and unemployment shoots up to 20%. All bets are off. But if the economy continues to stabilize, housing market, the Dow's come off its bottom significantly, and unemployment, came down last month. Some of the numbers are a little bit hazy, but the unemployment number definitely came down, and I think a lot of people are going to go back to work once the economy opens up a bit. So again, I'm generally bullish about where the local regional housing market's going.
Okay, Joe, this is great. We really appreciate it. It was a wonderful session. The one thing that I would encourage all of the folks who are still on the session right now is it is not back to normal, as I've been saying for quite some time. Even though you can now conduct in-person showings, there are very specific guidelines that you have to adhere to. So please go on our website or the NYSAR website and learn about what those specific guidelines are so you can show properties safely. Again, Joe, can't thank you enough. To everybody who's watching, be safe, be well.
Richard, I just